Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today's question comes to us from the True Stories collection, as in, it actually happened, an event I was actually judging. Amy concedes game 1 because she's dead on board next turn to Nick's abhorrent Oculus and its army of 2/2 manifests. Afterwards, Nick collects up his permanents and Amy calls for a judge, saying that Nick did not reveal his face-down cards before putting them back in his library. Nick says he doesn't understand why he would have to do that. What is the appropriate infraction, penalty, and fix? Okay, so I imagine there probably are some of you who are wondering what the actual problem is. I mean, obviously you would have to reveal cards you played with Morph, because otherwise there would be no way for the opponent to confirm that the card you played actually had this mechanic. And so, what I consider the biggest takeaway from this episode is the following PSA. Although you can legally manifest any card, as you can see, the rule is that officially, at the end of the game, all of your face-down cards must be revealed, no matter how they ended up like that. The same is true if you leave a multiplayer game before it ends. It is true that this rule predates Manifest and other mechanics that could legally put any card face down, but I would hazard a guess that they were never changed so that people wouldn't have to remember which cards were face down because of which effects at the end of the game. That is, of course, supposed to be something that you're keeping track of anyway, but as a judge, I'm grateful I don't have to try to arbitrate situations where one player assures me that the card they shuffled in was one of their manifests, and the opponent steadfastly insists that it was actually one of their morphs. Now that we've established what the actual issue is, let's classify it into a specific infraction. As usual, I'll start by considering that this happened at competitive rel first, since the fixes there are more strictly standardized by Magic's policy documents. And then I'll suggest how I might modify this remedy if the game were instead a regular rel game. Nick has committed an error that cannot be corrected with information that Amy has access to. After putting a face-down permanent in with the rest of his library, there's no way for Amy to know which card that he didn't reveal, and this fits the definition for a hidden card error. Regarding the penalty, there was a time in Magic's history when this would have been a game loss. The theory being that harsher penalties are warranted for mistakes that the opponent cannot catch, or ones that lead to a situation where the opponent cannot verify whether you have made a legal play. This was changed a few months into the original Tarkir block amid concerns over the high number of game losses that were being handed out for this relatively low value, easy to commit infraction. Specifically, it was pointed out that the advantage gained from playing the worst card in your hand as a 3-mana 2/2 was very low, a sentiment that's only gotten more true in the face of Magic's ever-expanding power creep. It also is very easy to get caught if you were to try a cheat like this. The longer the creature's on the board, the easier it would be for the opponent to cause it to leave the battlefield, at which point the jig would be up. And so the powers that be changed the penalty for this failure to reveal into a warning, with a higher penalty reserved only for specific circumstances, such as intentionally not revealing cards while knowing that you had to. If you'd like more information on why this change was made, I've linked the relevant announcement article in the comments. For more on the history of this infraction or the penalty and the fix in some of these further related cases, check out my dedicated video on face-down spells and permanents. For this video, we'll consider only the case presented in the original problem statement, where Nick did not reveal because he didn't know about this rule. Regarding the fix, this is actually a little bit hazy from just the words in Magic's published policy documents, because this policy was written for the generally more common case where a player forgets to reveal with something like a mystical tutor. And adapting this to forgetting to reveal a morph isn't that clean of a process. The general guidance is to reveal the set that contains the cards that were supposed to be revealed, but there's also this line that says if that set no longer exists, there's no way to perform any remedy at all. The fix will be based on the head judge's interpretation of how these lines apply to the situation in the actual game, which can span a range of possibilities, each with its own nuances that might sway a judge to prefer one fix or another. As such, I can present some guidance and some opinions based on how I interpret the relevant policy, but I can't guarantee that another judge might or might not rule differently from me based on either a different reading or some unusual circumstance in a live game that changes the policy's application. So if I'm the head judge, I think there's a few major categories that this error tends to fall into that will inform which way that I'll proceed. The best case scenario is if both players can agree on what all the cards that were supposed to be revealed were, and it's still reasonable to access all of them. For instance, maybe Amy stopped Nick when he was starting to pick up all his permanents, but before he had moved any of them in with cards from his other game zones. Or maybe both players agree that there were 3 manifests and Nick has put all of them on the bottom of his library. In these cases, I would just have Nick reveal the cards that he was supposed to. I might even not give a warning, depending on the circumstances. After all, the infraction is not revealing the face-down cards, so if it is still possible for Nick to fulfill this obligation, it might be reasonable to downgrade it into just a please play more carefully in the future. The next step up would be if Nick had started to combine his cards such that it was not apparent which cards were the manifests, but the players at least agree they are all in a pile together with other cards. Specifically, other cards Amy would have seen, such as Nick's other permanents and his graveyard. In that case, I would assign a warning, and I would have Amy look through that pile. The worst case scenario would be if Nick had already put his face down cards in with other cards Amy would not have seen, such as those from his hand or library. In this case, I would rule that any fix I could perform would be more disruptive to the match than just applying no fix. Other judges might disagree and advocate for making it up to Amy by revealing all the cards in those zones, or perhaps revealing some number of randomly chosen cards corresponding to the number of manifests. I feel alright doing something like that at regular rel, but for competitive, I feel like the fixes should be more deterministic, and I interpret the line about not applying any fix if the set no longer exists as being relevant to this sort of case. Speaking of regular rel, I think the fixes that I've discussed are pretty similar to what I would do in an F&M or similar environment, with the caveat that I would be more likely to let the exact circumstances around the infraction sway what I would do to make it fit the better. This sort of flexibility is specific to the more casual environment, and I think that this scenario particularly benefits from it. That said, players in a regular rel event are, in my experience, much less likely to care about getting to see a few random cards from their opponent's deck. Different stores have different expectations about how close to the rules players must play, though, and it's definitely within the realm of possibility that fixes from competitive rel could be ported in their entirety. Equally plausible would be for a player to voluntarily suggest that the opponent thumb through their entire deck. A couple of closing thoughts before I sign out. First, remember that we're assuming both Amy and Nick are acting in good faith here. It certainly is possible this is not the case, and the judge should be taking that into account. If the head judge believes Nick knew about the rules and intentionally didn't show his manifests to deny information to Amy, the appropriate penalty is a disqualification at any rules enforcement level. If the head judge believes Amy intentionally delayed calling a judge in the hopes that Nick would receive a harsher penalty, the same thing would be appropriate for her. That said, I think the assumption that the players are acting in good faith is a good one to start out with, since this rule is not something that you would know about, nor would I say players could reasonably anticipate it unless it had come up before. Second, players are very prone to overestimating the amount of value seeing or not seeing one or two random cards from an opponent's deck represents. Especially after Game 1, most competent tournament players would be able to produce maybe about 80% of their opponent's list with a pretty high degree of confidence, unless Nick was playing some kind of oddball deck that's unusual in the metagame. That being the case, I think doing nothing is a reasonable baseline, simply out of the practical concern of not wanting to incentivize Amy to wait to call a judge until the game has progressed to an unrecoverable state. That's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another Daily Ruling. Until then, I hope you have a great day.